Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How wonderful to see so many of you here. Not that I'm surprised with the amazing guests this evening. So my name's Kate Mosse. I'm a novelist and a playwright and have the great good fortune to do these pre-show talks. It's a great privilege always to interview Sir Richard Eyre. It's also an enormous privilege to be here right at the beginning to talk about a brand new play. So, Richard Eyre, there's no point reading a CV because you are just brilliant across all things, as we know. So, but television and film and opera and writing and almost everything, you are a Renaissance man. But this is the most extraordinary piece. I saw it last night, and it's a brand new piece of work inspired by something real that happened. So can you just say a little bit about the play without giving anything away and how you and Nicholas Wright decided to do this play here for us?
Yes.
Good.
I have been... Nick Wright and I have been friends for about 50 years, certainly since the 60s when Nick was at the Royal Court and for a while ran the Royal Court, was director of the Royal Court with a director called Robert Kidd. And then when I became director of the National Theatre, Nick was the associate on whom I depended most. And I put on a play of his then called Mrs. Klein, a wonderful play about the child psychiatrist. Mrs. Klein was a great success and was transferred to a theatre in New York, a new production. In the production in New York, playing Mrs. Klein was Uta Hagen. So you could say that in some way, indirectly, I was responsible for the genesis of this play in that I put on Nick's Mrs. Klein. When I left the National, Nick always told me what he was writing, but very, very succinctly, I was driving to what I now know is called Chai. But
Yes.
I always thought it was Chi. Anyway, Chai.
That's altogether different.
Okay, Chai. Driving to Chai, we were driving to see a production in this theatre of Pal Joey. And Nick said, I said, what are you writing? He said, I'm writing this play about Van Gogh in Brixton, actually down the road from where you used to live. I said, oh, that's interesting. Anyway, 6 months later or so, Nick sent me the play, which was called Vincent in Brixton, and I did the play at the National Theatre. We had the most wonderful time with a great cast. Fledgling 17-year-old called Emily Blunt was playing the maid. That also went to New York. So since then, I have done 3 more plays of Nick, a play called The Reporter, a play called The Last of the Duchess, and this play. And in a similar way, Nick said to me, oh, I'm writing, what are you writing? He said, I'm writing a play about Paul Robeson and Uta Hagen. And I had seen Uta Hagen in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf in 1962 or 3, and was completely thunderstruck. I was capsized by her performance. It was more or less then, well, certainly then, and more or less now, the best performance I'd ever seen in a theatre. So these strange kind of conduits of coincidence come together. Paul Robeson I knew of. The thing about Nick and I is we're both quite old. And I used to say I can no longer use the joke that one of the reasons I like working at Chichester is that I'm the youngest person in the audience. Because
Cheeky.
Manifestly I'm not, and nor is Nick. And one of the delights of working with Nick is that we share a lot of common references. This is a play that is, in some sense, about theatre. But theatre is the sort of template on which a lot of ideas are explored, ideas about jealousy, about revenge, about subjects which are dealt with in or emerge in Othello, about racism, about sexual identity values of women, sexual values in society and in relationships. So all these things boil up, and Nick Wright's extraordinarily distilled dialogue. Very, very few stage directions. And one of the delights of working on the play is that you don't get pushed around by the writer. I dislike writers like Shaw, who are afraid of allowing a single line to escape from their pen without a qualifying stage direction.
And a page and a half of description.
A page and a half of description, but we were talking earlier about your play, which we're not allowed to talk about, obviously, but you were saying when you started writing it, the temptation was to describe every line with an instruction to the actor or the director. I love having a plain page which you just mine the page and you discover meanings within the dialogue without being pushed by the writer. And only occasionally will I say to Nick, what is it that you meant by this line, in order to
because sometimes the writer has the emotion, but the word that any of us might choose is slightly off from the emotion you wanted. So, but with this, so it is set and inspired by the real Broadway success of Othello, with Robeson and Uta and Joe and Peggy.
An English director who, as she tells you in the play, was coincidentally born in the US, a director called Margaret Webster, who was a distinguished Anglo-American director, and she presented this production of Othello and directed the production of Othello. Now, Robeson had actually played Othello in this country, famously with Desdemona, Peggy Ashcroft, as Desdemona. Equally famously, she and Paul Robeson had a notorious affair. And Paul Robeson's wife had discovered about the affair by finding a letter from Peggy Ashcroft in her dressing gown, in his dressing gown. So Peggy, and this is an interesting reflection on what I regard as the great fault line in American society, which is racism, and obviously as a consequence of slavery and the Civil War, that it was wildly controversial to present Othello in the US on tour with a black Othello. Yeah. And
even though he was a star. I mean,
even though he was a star, he had been in movies, he was famous, a famous recording star. His signature song was Old Man River from Showboat, with not with the original lyrics, which are astonishingly crude and unambiguously patronizing. No, he was very, very well known, but as a singer and an activist, a sort of activist before the word was coined. So he was in the 40s, whereas you think of the great civil rights battles being in the late 50s and 60s, he was actually having those public meetings in the 40s. This play starts in 1944. And I can remember Paul Robeson as a child. I was born in 1943. So I can remember as a 10 or 12-year-old in the 50s, seeing Robeson's face in the paper and identifying him as I mean, I wouldn't have called it civil rights leader, but somebody who was in the news, and in the news because he was fighting for the rights of people of colour.
So with the play, the sort of premise of the play, and you and Nick have discussed it, but he's very honest, and he says this is a theatrical representation of, it isn't a piece of history, it's inspired by the real history. So there's only 4 actors. When you get a brand new script that is, I mean, it's so beautiful, what we will see, what everybody will see this evening. But when you first read a script that nobody else has seen, just him and then you, how do you react to what you might want to change or amend or ask, or how does that process between you and he work? Because it's a very rare working relationship.
I think I respond viscerally to scripts, and I think reading play scripts is quite hard. And I think it's the analogy of reading a musical score is an accurate one. And if you just, I think if I handed most people were to read Nick's play script without being nudged in certain directions, they would find it quite difficult, precisely because, to my delight, he doesn't have, as I said, doesn't put a lot of stage directions in. I react viscerally. I liked it immediately I read it. Why? Because it was about things that mattered, and also because there was an actor called Denham Elliott. Yeah. Marvellous, marvellous actor.
He played here.
Denham? Yeah. Oh, did he? Well, he died a few years ago. And Denham, I did a film with him for television. And I said, he said he'd like to do it. And I said, Denham, what makes you decide, how do you decide to do things? He said, well, I open the script in the middle. And if there's anybody speaking who I think I'd like to have a drink with, then I decide to read it from the... And I think that actually is as good a criterion as any. And I was immediately attracted by these people, Uta Hagen and the young Uta Hagen, and the energy of it. I love, I mean, Robeson's voice and the presence of Robeson. I mean, hugely attractive man. So that was there in my memory, and also because it isn't a history play. It absolutely is faithful to the historical facts. There is no monkeying around with history, but actually it's not a history play. No. The truth is it's a love story. Yeah. And I think that was what struck me, first of all, that it's an unsentimental love story about 2 very, very strong people, and a man who actually destroys himself through his either his stubbornness or his determination not to concede to his ideals. So it's a very, very attractive mixture of, I mean, they're not issues because they're not dealt with, and I really do detest plays that deal with issues.
Yes, they bang you over the head with them.
My heart sinks when people say, oh, it's dealing with the issues of sexism and race. And I think, oh, I want a play, because plays are about people. They're about interaction of people, and issues emerge. They're for the commentators, not for the characters in a play.
But one of the things I felt watching it last night that was so precisely brilliant about that was that it was the consequence of having principle, all of them having principles, in a time when having a principle would kill your career, at the very least. So, you know, Jose Ferrer is Puerto Rican. Margaret, Peggy, we know actually was gay. Paul Robeson is black, and Uta is young. And they refuse to let him be not given a hotel room. You know, they move out of the hotel, you know, those sorts of things. But it is a play about consequence, what it means to stand up for what you believe in. I thought that was one of the most powerful things about it.
Yes, and it's to do with betrayal, and the play is very satisfying in the way that it sets one character's betrayal against another character's betrayal, and they're different forms of betrayal. And you get these delightful echoes of Othello, too, when Paul talks in the last scene about the cause, and you think, actually, it's almost as wrong-headed as Othello when Othello said, it is the cause, when he's on his way to murder Desdemona, in his view, righteously. So it just holds a lot of decision. As you say, I mean, all actions have their consequence, and that is, I think, the great moral law of the human universe, and it brilliantly explores that proposition.
And with a writer as great as Nick Wright, and also your long relationship with him, so you know his work and he knows your careful hands, as it were, how much changing of a new script goes on once you get into a theatre, or once you get into the rehearsal room before that?
We changed, I think there were 3 drafts, but there weren't substantial changes. The title was originally called Othello, 8 Hotels. And I said, can we just junk the Othello? And there were minor changes. There's a big fight scene, which was the only scene that was rewritten. The end of it was rewritten, not on my advice, actually, but and there were minor changes that made and cuts. And during rehearsals, very few. Every now and then, an actor, or I would say, do we really need this? Or I really don't think this line is doing what you want it to do, and can we try something else?
Is that about making it more taut, or about pace, or just about having...
Clarity, I think. Clarity. But we work... I mean, one of the reasons the show is as it is because these are 4 remarkable grown-up actors who are very, very fastidious, and as fastidious as Nick is and I am, and love mining the detail. And really, you know, the difference between good and bad art is quite simple. It's bad art generalizes, and good art is specific. And it's, you know, every moment of this play has been examined, and it's examined and absorbed and then executed. And so it's quite rare to get such harmony of process in 4 actors. Quite often you get one actor who goes, you know, and 2 or 3 others who work in an entirely different way. And the job of the director is just to try and bring them in so that you're all talking the same language of process. But it's fun. I mean, for me, there is no greater fun than rehearsing a wonderful play with wonderful actors, because good actors, by definition, are intelligent and witty. And they're not necessarily articulate, but they're witty and sharp and fast. And it's just, you know, you get paid for it. It's wonderful.
But, I mean, one of the things that I thought was so extraordinary, what had been achieved, was that they are all heroes in one way, for they all have enormous reputations. They are real people with a body of work behind them. But yet, at the same time, it was completely an ensemble piece. And so you didn't have that thing when sometimes, you know, when in some plays a character comes in and it's like a blast of cold air comes in the door too. You know, the tenor changes.
Yes, I know those plays. Yes.
Whereas this was extraordinarily sort of compact all the way through. And can you just say a little bit, without spoiling, I don't want to spoil any... we're not going to sit on the bed. We're going to stay on our chairs. Right. Although the bed is really hard, ladies and gents. There are some beautiful pieces of design, which I'm not going to spoil for those of you who have not yet seen it. But when you are doing a play that travels all over America, but of course the point is the hotels they stay in on the tour, at what point do you bring a designer in and say, well, I need this sort of room? Or, you know, was there a choice about making each room different? You know, just talk a little bit about how the design supports the play.
Again, I've worked a lot with Rob Howell, the designer. Rob designed a play of Nick's we did at the National Theatre called The Reporter, about the BBC reporter James Mossman. So we know, we look for a kind of arena. I said to Rob, it's kind of like a boxing ring, hotel room. Clearly the hotel room is doesn't change. The room, there aren't going to be scene changes. The scenery isn't going to move.
Because they change and the room is the same.
And late in rehearsals, actually, initially we decided not to change anything in the room. Late in rehearsals, a sort of half sleepless night, I came in, I said, I think we need to change the bedspread. A huge conceptual...
Sucking in of 40.
There was a certain amount, and I got a slightly panicked call from Rob, who was in London, saying, are you sure? You know, I thought the concept was... I said, no, I'm absolutely sure, you know, it's right. And it is right. And that's really, you know, the actors move furniture, and the change is done by quite small details, and through the lighting, and through, you're just told where you are. The cities they travel to appear on a caption, and between each scene, I always thought we wanted a feeling of documentary life in black and white either side. So Rob designed they're billboards, really, and in his first design they were more complicated, and we just simplified them. And it's a wonderful sort of perspective cube, I mean, that has been crushed with this. And so it really does concentrate, it focuses attention on a series of of scenes that are quite short, never more than about 20 minutes, and never more, the four characters only appear in one scene. But it's very, very detailed, very concentrated, and I think very lucidly and beautifully played. So this is an arena, really. It's like it's a boxing ring, and at one stage, I'm afraid it feels like, you know, a fight.
But I mean, actually, the play covers a wider period of time anyway, because it starts in the war and all of that, and of course, then we go into the McCarthy era and that piece of history. But I thought it was very beautiful the way their clothes changed.
Yes.
But in a way, the reality of their lives as actors didn't change.
Well, the clothes, because the design is minimalist, the clothes are absolutely crucial, and they were discussed in great detail. We all discussed them, the actors, and individually with the designer and the costume supervisor. And I just had I said to Rob, when she comes in the end, 1956, I wanted to look like Audrey Hepburn. And what I meant was sort of Givenchy. And about 3 months ago, I was sent a script it was called Audrey and Me. And it was a film script, movie script, and it was about Givenchy designing clothes for Audrey Hepburn. This is a movie. So I read that. So I was sort of thinking a lot Givenchy. What I meant was those sort of black capri pants and
wonderful
sort of
shoes.
wonderful shoes, and then Rob found this exquisite white coat. So it's a bit of a shock when she comes in, and that
she looks so not the young girl that...
It does a lot of the work of saying, you know, years have passed, she's become very successful, she's become comparatively well off. She's in the first scene saying, can I have $100 to buy a new dress? And her husband saying, no, you can't, because that's a waste of money. And then seeing someone she's become very, very much a person with her own authority, and his authority has sort of dwindled, and he's in this rather poor rooming house.
Yeah. Looking into each of the characters and seeing when they had died and how long ago. And you have talked about you and Nick being in New York, and I know he interviewed Uta Hagen a couple of times. And for those of you who are old Chai people, Jose Ferrer was here for Cyrano in 1975, actually involved in directing at that moment. Was there a decision to wait until they had all died before doing the play? Because there's quite a long genesis in Nick's mind, clearly, from when you were first over in Broadway. Or was that just how it's fallen out?
No. I think the play is a commission. I mean, very, very few commissions actually turn into successful plays, or indeed into plays. Quite a lot of commissions, actually. The plays are never delivered. I mean, in my life, I have one example of a play which I commissioned. I put in the brochure before a word of the play had been written. It was 1974. It was a play called Comedians by Trevor Griffiths. Oh. And he just told me, he said, I've got this idea about a night class for club comedians. That's great, fantastic. Let's do it. And we talked about the characters before he'd written. And I said, there's this actor called Jonathan Pryce, who I think should play the guy you've described. But mostly commissions don't work like that. And I think I used to have a sort of kamikaze policy when I was running Nottingham Playhouse in the 70s of, so we'll do this play, and then hoping that the writer would deliver it. And occasionally they did, but more often they didn't. So this was commissioned. And I don't know how long it had been marinating in Nick's mind, but it was commissioned maybe 3 years ago. And so there was another play that I was interested in that Nick had written about Benazir Bhutto, about the assassination of Benazir Bhutto, which hasn't got on. So I think he's probably writing them in parallel. But it's interesting. I feel that the play is very topical. It's
astonishing because it is so of its period and of its time and truthful to those attitudes, but horribly resonant now, suddenly, not least of all the very first place that they go to on their tour.
Yes, absolutely. So that is just, I think, a writer marinating in the culture of their times, and it just absorbing, by a sort of process of osmosis, what is going on in the country, and somehow writing that through a historical play. And I think that tends to be, for me, the more effective way of writing about the contemporary world than writing about the contemporary world on the nose. And, I dread the Brexit play.
Yes. Probably not yet commissioned. But for now, it's always such a pleasure to talk to you, and it is such a privilege, I think, for all of us to be not just at the first performance of a play, but this is a world premiere, the first one, part of the 29 season here. And those things don't come around so very often. So, ladies and gentlemen, Sir Richard Eyre.